forgiven, but still executed, the Curtis Windom story that shook Florida. 33 years after a night of bloodshed, the man at the center of one of Florida's most haunting crimes took his final breaths. Not in the chaos of the streets, but strapped to a gurney in the state's death chamber. Outside, the air was heavy with grief, anger, and disbelief. Inside, Curtis Windom's life ended by lethal injection, despite the fact that the very people who had lost the most, the families of his victims, had long since forgiven him and fought to keep him alive. This is not just the story of a triple murder. It's the story of a decades-long journey through violence, remorse, redemption, and a final act by the state that split public opinion and left a lingering question. What is justice when forgiveness has already been given? On November 7th, 1992, Curtis Windom's life and the lives of 3 others collided in a chain of events that would echo for decades. According to court records, it began with a rumor. A friend told Windom that Johnnie Lee, a man who allegedly owed him $2,000, had just won 114 tons at a Greyhound racetrack. Windom's chilling response was, "You're gonna read about me." Fueled by anger and a sense of betrayal, he drove to a Walmart, purchased a .38 caliber revolver and a box of 50 shells, and set out to find Lee. What followed was a calculated act of violence. Windom shot Lee twice in the back from his car, then approached and fired 2 more rounds at close range. But the night's violence didn't end there. Windom drove to the apartment of his girlfriend, Valerie Davis, the mother of one of his children, and, in front of a friend, shot her without provocation. Moments later, he wounded another man before targeting Davis's mother, Mary Lubin, shooting her in her car at a stop sign as she rushed to her daughter's apartment. By the end of the night, 3 people were dead, 1 was injured, and a community was shattered. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony, ballistic reports, and Windom's own actions painted a grim picture. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The sentence, death for the murders, plus 22 years for the attempted killing. For the families of the victims, the trial was a blur of grief and legal proceedings. For Windom, it marked the beginning of a 33-year journey on death row, a journey that would transform relationships in ways no one could have predicted. Over the decades, something unexpected happened. The families of Valerie Davis, Mary Lubin, and Johnnie Lee, the very people who had every reason to hate Windom, began to rebuild a connection with him. They visited him in prison. They spoke to him on the phone. They celebrated graduations and weddings with him over the line. They brought his grandchildren to see him through the thick visitation glass. Valerie Davis's daughter, Katisha Windom, who had once been a child caught in the shadow of her father's crimes, grew into a woman who chose forgiveness. Forgiveness comes with time, and 33 years is a long time, she said. I myself have forgiven my father. The families even issued a joint statement. We have continued to love and care for each other, teaching our children that there is no use in punishing the many for the acts of the few. Most of all, we have continued to love and care for Curtis. As Windom's execution date approached, the families united in an extraordinary campaign, not for harsher punishment, but for mercy. They pleaded with Florida officials to halt the execution, arguing that true healing had already taken place. They were joined by advocacy groups like Floridians for alternatives to the death penalty, who argued that forgiveness and healing do not come from a lethal injection in the death chamber. But the state was unmoved. Governor Ron DeSantis had signed a record number of death warrants in 2025, and Windom's was among them. His lawyers filed appeal after appeal, claiming ineffective counsel and citing his mental health struggles. The US Supreme Court rejected his final appeal just 1 day before the scheduled execution. On August 28, 2025, at Florida State Prison near Stark, the curtain to the death chamber was raised. Windom lay strapped to the gurney, his face covered by a sheet. Witnesses reported that as the lethal drugs entered his system, he took deep breaths, his legs twitching before he went still. At 6:17 p.m., Curtis Windom was pronounced dead. Outside, Davis's sister, Camille Hunter, wore a t-shirt that read, "Justice for her, healing for me." She told reporters, "It took 33 years to get some closure. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." But for others, the execution was not closure. It was a reopening of wounds. The family's joint statement after the execution was both heartbreaking and defiant. "We are heartbroken that the state of Florida didn't listen to our pleas. His execution tonight stopped that healing in its tracks and replaced it with new pain." Advocates accused the state of using the execution to flex political muscle rather than serve justice. Supporters of the death penalty argued that the punishment fit the crime. What no one could deny was that Florida had set a grim record: 11 executions in a single year, more than any other state. Texas and South Carolina trailed far behind with 4 each. Windom's case forces a confrontation with one of the most difficult questions in criminal justice. If the people most harmed by a crime have forgiven the offender, should the state still carry out the ultimate punishment? For some, the answer is yes. The law is the law, and justice must be served regardless of personal feelings. For others, Windom's execution represents a failure to recognize the power of redemption and the human capacity for change. The families say they will continue to tell their story, not just of the crime, but of the decades that followed, of the phone calls, the visits, the moments of connection that defied the bars and the labels, of the belief that love and forgiveness can exist even in the shadow of unimaginable loss. For them, Curtis Windom's life was more than the worst thing he ever did. And his death, they say, will not be the end of the conversation. In the end, the Curtis Windom story is not just about murder and punishment. It's about the collision of justice and mercy, the limits of the law, and the enduring question of whether a state can truly claim to serve its people when it ignores the voices of those who have already found peace.